So this is actually part 12 of a video project based on my first book, The God Dare. And The God Dare is essentially an invitation to non-religious people and even to religious people who have stopped sensing the presence of God. It is an experimental dare to get people to engage in such a way that they come to experience God. As a former atheist, I believe that there is a biblical, predictable path that sets one up to encounter God by following some very basic biblical principles. So today I'm going to talk about fasting because fasting is one of the most important tools that sets up the possibility of an encounter with God. And I'm asked a lot of questions about fasting, and I would start by saying that what fasting does is it stops the cycle of prayer being interrupted, and it starts allowing prayer to be that which interrupts our busy activities and our busy life. So a number of years ago, my children and I went with a couple from our church. We went camping, and the three adults, one evening we built a campfire because it was particularly cold, and the children all had bicycles and things, and they spent a lot of time playing, while the adults mostly sat around the fire keeping warm. We visited some, we talked, and so forth, but each of us also had brought a book, and we were each doing a lot of reading. But it seemed like every time we would make progress in our reading, one of our children would end up interrupting. Now, Jennifer, who was the only female on the trip, besides her kids, she was interrupted the most. I think that's just the plague of being a mom. But about every time she would get about 2 or 3 pages into reading, one of her children would come and say, Mom, I need something. And Jennifer would have to go back and reread the 3 pages. She'd kind of forget what she had read. And finally, in frustration, she gave up after she realized that she had read the same 3 pages about 10 times and did not remember anything of which she had read. I think all of us know that experience. Sometimes work is like that, isn't it? About the time you really start making some good progress, somebody walks in your office, the phone rings, you look down and your once empty inbox now has 50 emails in it. I think we all know that experience. But there's nothing that seems to get interrupted more than prayer. It seems like the very act of bowing one's head and closing one's eyes prompts somebody to walk in the room, the phone to ring, the cat to jump on your lap, your dog to come around and need something. And what fasting does is it breaks that cycle of interruption and allows prayer to start interrupting some things for a change. So let me give you 3 biblical ideas about fasting. The first one comes from Matthew 6. Jesus talks about 3 spiritual practices that he assumes all of his followers are going to partake of and participate in. One is almsgiving, which is giving money to the poor. The second is prayer, and the third is fasting. And when you read in Matthew 6, Jesus doesn't say if you do these things. He says when you give alms, when you pray, when you fast. He assumes that all of his followers are going to participate in these things. When he speaks about fasting, he says, don't look glum when you're fasting. Don't go around complaining about how hungry you are. Don't go around moaning and groaning so that folks think you're being heroic for God. Fasting's not a merit badge. It's not a way of proving to others how dedicated you are to God. It is about focusing on God himself. It is about letting prayer do the interrupting. So what happens is when we go a day without fasting or without eating, for example, every time we feel hunger pains, it reminds us to pray. Or perhaps we decide to fast from social media. Every time we go to pick up our phone to do that, instead, it reminds us, it prompts us to focus our attention on God. The second biblical idea comes from Isaiah 58, particularly verses 1 through 9. Isaiah is dealing with a very different kind of situation than Jesus is talking about. In Matthew 6, Jesus is talking about people who use their spiritual disciplines as a way of getting applause from others. And he says that that's what you want, that's all you'll ever get out of it. But God has something more to give you if you do it for different reasons. In Isaiah 58, the problem is that people are fasting. They don't understand why it's not getting God's attention. They said, we're fasting. And God says, you know, you're right, you do fast. But when you fast, you get cranky, you fight with each other. Plus, you go on living as if nothing has changed. You exploit the poor, you cheat on your business partners. He says, here's the kind of fast I want from you. I want the kind of fast that leads you to be more sensitive to others. I want you to do the kind of fast that makes you more aware of the things that break my heart, so that those things begin to break your heart. I want your fasting to lead you to recognize that there are people that are really suffering in the world. This little bit of discomfort, this little bit of inconvenience is not suffering so that you've done something hard for God. You're not doing a favor for God, and fasting doesn't make God love you more. He already loves you an infinite amount. Neither is it doing a favor for God so that He's on the hook to do you a favor. Nor is it a way of getting to the front of the line so your prayers get answered first. It is not about getting God's attention. We already have God's attention. What fasting is about is God getting our attention so that we become sensitive to the real needs in the world. So one of the ways of fasting is if we give up, say, coffee for Lent, that money would go to feed hungry children or to a school system that needs it. Maybe if we gave up food for the day, that we would send that money to do something to care for the environment or to care for women in a homeless shelter. So Isaiah 58 says that fasting is really about God getting our attention. Then the third thing that fasting does is it helps develop in us a hunger for God. In John chapter 4, we read the story of Jesus at the well, where he talks to the woman at the well. But here's the thing. It's a hot day. They're traveling through this foreign area, and Jesus sits down beside the well, and the disciples go off to get food and provisions. While they're away, Jesus has this encounter with this woman, and he talks with her, and he reveals things about God to her. When they come back, they're surprised. When the disciples come back, that is, they're surprised to find Jesus talking to this woman. And they say, hey, Master, Rabbi, take a break, eat something. Jesus responds saying, I already have had something to eat. In fact, I've had something to eat that you know nothing about. And they're perplexed. They think, what? We went off to get food and you already got food? But that's not what Jesus was talking about. And he says, that's not what I'm talking about. My food, that which I desire most, is to do the will of my Father and to complete his work. And what Jesus shows us is that fasting is a way of reminding ourselves that we have a deeper need. We have a deeper hunger. We have a deeper desire than simply for food. So one of the things that can happen as we go without food or drink or something else is that it reminds us that the soul craves something more. It invites us to taste and see that the Lord is good. Now, let me give you some practical advice for fasting. I prefer to do the Wesleyan fast. The Wesleyan fast is after the evening meal on Thursday, that you then skip breakfast and lunch the next day and break fast during the evening meal. In other words, you really just miss 2 meals, but it ends up being a 24-hour fast. John Wesley and the early Methodists actually did this twice a week, on Wednesday and on Friday. It was a practice John Wesley did all of his life, and Methodists did this for more than a century. John Wesley, when preaching about fasting, said that he believed that the lack of fasting was one of the things that stifled revival. Here's why. It's not because you're fasting that God owes you revival. We can't make God bring revival, and nor do we desire revival more than God desires. In fact, we desire it quite a bit less. But what fasting does is it whets our appetite. It gets us hungry and thirsty and yearning for the things of God, which God desires to give us. See, really what stands in the way of revival is not God's desire, but our lack of desire. Our lack of desire and hunger and thirst for the things of God. And so John Wesley said, if you were fasting on a regular basis, it would develop in you a hunger and thirst for God, thus setting you up for the possibility of revival. But because you've grown indifferent to the things of God, it makes it much less likely that God is going to be willing to bring about revival for those who really do not desire the things of God. So, here's my dare for you, and it is the 8th dare in the series. But if you want to experience a real hunger for God, and set yourself up for the possibility of a really powerful encounter with God, I dare you to fast. Spend some regular time giving up something pleasurable. If you can't give up food because of medical condition, you could eat more simple food. Or you could give up social media, or you could give up watching Netflix for a day. And every time you desire to do this, remind yourself that there's something your soul desires even more. That is to taste and see that the Lord is good. I dare you to experience the God dare.